Okay, this will be a video about the actor and singer Harry Connick Jr. and his really fascinating, really interesting connection to the JFK assassination. And you're probably thinking to yourself, oh my God, another video about the JFK assassination. There are roughly 9 trillion books and movies and documentaries already out there about the Kennedy assassination. And really, the last thing the world needs is yet another one. But this Harry Connick Jr. connection to the JFK assassination is really interesting, and it's something that I never really see mentioned anywhere. So I wanted to make a quick video about this really fascinating little connection here. So we'll just kind of get into it, and we'll start with Jim Garrison, who most people know was the district attorney in New Orleans, and he obviously went super hard into investigating the JFK conspiracy. Kevin Costner plays him in the movie JFK. And since he was the district attorney, he could use his office's powers in his investigation. He could subpoena people to testify, get him under oath, and he even charged Clay Shaw with conspiring to kill President Kennedy. And there was a trial where Jim Garrison presented his case. And still to this day, Clay Shaw is the only person to stand trial for his involvement in the JFK assassination. And in this Clay Shaw trial, the U.S. Justice Department had a representative at the trial who was an assistant U.S. attorney named Harry Connick Sr., who's obviously Harry Connick Jr.'s dad. And Harry Connick Sr. was kind of like the dude for the U.S. Justice Department at the trial. He would sit next to government witnesses who Jim Garrison called, and he sat with these witnesses during pre-trial questioning, and he was described in this Destiny Portrayed book about the JFK assassination. He was described as a near constant presence in the courtroom. Now, Clay Shaw was eventually found innocent, and a few years later, in 1973, Jim Garrison was up for re-election because this district attorney position was an elected office, so he had to be re-elected every 4 years. And his main competition in this election was Harry Connick Sr. And again, this was in 1973, so it was like right during the heart of Jim Garrison's whole investigation into the JFK assassination. And in a stunning upset, Jim Garrison lost this election to Harry Connick Sr. And right from the start, Jim Garrison claimed voter fraud. He refused to accept the results, and he filed a lawsuit. He claimed he'd found over 10,000 irregularities in the votes for Harry Connick. But he lost the lawsuit, and he lost his district attorney position, and all of the research and investigation and all of the work he was putting into the Kennedy assassination. Everything he'd compiled remained at the district attorney's office, and it was up to Harry Connick to continue that Jim Garrison investigation. And Harry Connick did absolutely nothing with everything that he inherited. He didn't follow up on anything. He didn't investigate any of these leads. And all of this research and momentum that Jim Garrison had with his investigation, Harry Connick basically just torpedoed all of this work that Jim Garrison had done. And the full extent of what he did to cover up Jim Garrison's work eventually came out, but it took a really long time because in 1992, the federal government formed a committee called the U.S. Assassinations Records Review Board, and their intention was to make public everything related to the JFK assassination, all the files that the government had. And this was partially in response to the movie JFK, which came out right around this time and really brought up a lot of interest to the JFK assassination and kind of brought it back into the spotlight. And so, anyway, this board that was formed, they contacted the New Orleans District Attorney's Office for all of Jim Garrison's research material because they wanted to make it public. And Harry Connick was still the district attorney for New Orleans at this time because he kept winning elections after he won in 1974, and he served as the New Orleans district attorney for almost 30 years. So anyway, this board contacted Harry Connick's office for all of Jim Garrison's research files, and Harry Connick flat out refused to hand them over. And so this board issued a subpoena, and he refused to comply with that. And this was just crazy because everything else that this committee had requested had basically just been handed over to them. They'd even requested documents from like foreign governments, and they'd had no problems getting them. But for whatever reason, Harry Connick refused to hand over Jim Garrison's research files. There was even this quote from one of the board members. He says, Harry Connick's resistance unfortunately rises to a level we've not seen before. But the story gets way, way, way crazier because Harry Connick eventually claimed that the files had been lost by Jim Garrison's team back in the 1970s and they just didn't exist anymore. And then this guy, Richard Angelico, who was kind of like a legendary reporter in New Orleans for a very long time, he was contacted by a man named Gary Raymond. And this Gary Raymond had a crazy story because he said he'd worked in Harry Connick's office back in 1974 when Harry Connick took over for Jim Garrison, and he claimed that Harry Connick had ordered him to destroy Jim Garrison's files after Harry Connick took office. And instead of destroying them, this Gary Raymond had kept the files at his house for almost 2 decades. And finally, all the way in 1992, he came forward and gave the reporter Richard Angelico these files because he flat out said Harry Connick was just lying. He had this quote here. He says, "Not only is the man Harry Connick lying about these records, but he is trying to pin it on Garrison's people." And then Harry Connick filed a lawsuit to prevent the review board from getting the files of Jim Garrison, and this nasty battle broke out over whether this assassination review board was going to actually even get Jim Garrison's files and be able to make them public. And it's honestly crazy that Harry Connick was just so against the release of these files that he sued to prevent their release. And he even filed a lawsuit against Gary Raymond and Richard Angelico, and argued that they'd violated the state's grand jury secrecy laws because they'd gone behind his back and made these Garrison research files public. And Harry Connick actually won this lawsuit, and both Gary Raymond and Richard Angelico were sentenced to jail. And Richard Angelico appealed his sentence and won, so he didn't have to serve any time. But I couldn't find what happened to Gary Raymond. I don't know that if he actually served time or not, but it's just wild that Harry Connick was so against the release of these JFK files that he sued to prevent their release. And eventually, the review board won their lawsuit against Harry Connick, and the Jim Garrison research files were made public. And people who've reviewed these files have claimed there's really nothing explosive in them, but you do have to wonder if the contents of these files had already been destroyed or suppressed in some way. In this book, Destiny Betrayed, the author claims that he's reviewed these Jim Garrison files that were made public, and he estimated that around 60% of Jim Garrison's actual files were actually included in the material that was made public. So there was a whole bunch of stuff missing. And he claims that the rest were either burnt by Harry Connick or stolen over the years. And there was another very controversial, very just absolutely awful case that Harry Connick played a big role in. So in New Orleans in the 1980s, one of the very worst cases of child abuse of all time happened when this Catholic priest named Dino Cinel was found with this massive collection of horrible videos of him and a whole bunch of young boys in his church. And after this came out, it was described as the largest case of press pedophilia in the history of the crime. And this happened in December of 1988. And this was the church St. Rita's in New Orleans. And it was another priest in this church who found just hundreds upon hundreds of tapes and hundreds of hours that had been filmed of this Dino Cinel abusing young boys. And first off, it took 3 months before the church actually turned over these tapes to authorities. So there was a lot of question about, well, why had it taken 3 months to turn this in? It was honestly speculated that there were a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of other priests involved in this, and they were erasing evidence of just how massive this thing was. But eventually they did turn evidence of what had happened, what Dino Cinel had done, over to the district attorney of New Orleans, who was Harry Connick. And this happened in early 1989. And Harry Connick did absolutely nothing with the case. He didn't bring charges against Dino Cinel. He just sat on the evidence, and this thing remained a total secret. It was just totally swept under the rug and covered up, and nothing happened with this case for 2.5 years. And the only reason this case was revealed and exposed was this same reporter, as we talked about earlier, Richard Angelico. He was given evidence of these crimes and he broke the story. And he actually called this the biggest story that he ever broke in his career. And he reported on just all this abuse that had gone on years earlier. And he reported on the fact that Harry Connick's office was literally handed all this evidence of what had happened and did absolutely nothing with it. And Harry Connick just got absolutely ripped apart because of this cover-up. He even disappeared for a while because there was just so much outrage towards him. And he claimed he hadn't filed charges against Dino Cinel because he wanted to protect the reputation of this St. Rita's church, because he was actually a member of this same church, and he even knew Dino Cinel and had dinner with him before. So it's obviously really curious that
Harry Connick was also a member of this same church, and he knew Dino Cinel before this whole thing was revealed. Now, eventually, Harry Connick caved to the public pressure and he brought one count of possession against Dino Cinel. And this was honestly kind of considered ridiculous since he could have been charged with literally hundreds of counts of not just possession, but participating in this awful stuff. But even this one count was dropped. And Dino Cinel was never punished, despite there being literally hundreds of hours of him on videotape with young boys. And a clerk for the judge who heard the case had this quote. He said, "The judge ruled that the actions of the district attorney were basically a cover up." And so this Dino Cinel, who again was never punished for any of this awful stuff he was up to, he eventually left New Orleans and he got a teaching job at a college in New York. Then when this whole scandal broke, he was suspended from the teaching job and he fled to Italy. And eventually in 2018, he was in Colombia and he was stabbed to death by an 18-year-old boy who he was in a relationship, quote unquote, relationship with previously. So this case, I mean, it is just absolutely awful. There was this big article in Vanity Fair that brought a lot of attention to the case because it really went into graphic detail about some of the horrible stuff they found. And this article won a bunch of awards, but it's just a terrible story. And it's really honestly even more horrible that this whole thing was seemingly covered up by Harry Connick, and it would have never even gotten out had it not been for that reporter Richard Angelico breaking the story 2.5 years after it happened. So that brings us to Harry Connick Jr., who is obviously Harry Connick's son, and it just seems so coincidental that this guy who played such a huge role in not just covering up Jim Garrison's work, but actively destroying his research files and also covering up the Dino Cinel case. It seems pretty coincidental that this guy just happened to have a son who became this really big star in Hollywood. And Harry Connick Jr. is a really big star. I didn't realize how successful he was before I started this video. He's one of the best-selling jazz artists of all time. He's had 10 number 1 jazz albums. He was a judge on American Idol, and he just sold a $12 million house. So he's doing very well. And you do really have to wonder if his son making it big or getting his big break was some sort of payoff or reward for Harry Connick Sr. destroying Jim Garrison's JFK research, because destroying those files was really a huge element of this whole JFK cover up. And there's no like smoking gun here or like a contract written in blood or something that's like 100% evidence that Harry Connick Jr. got his big break and got his foot in the door as a payoff for what his dad did with the whole JFK assassination research. But the whole thing just seems so bizarre and coincidental. And there's actually a lot of celebrities like this who had parents with these really strange, interesting links to the military or the government or some really controversial events. Jack Black's mom was a NASA engineer who was like a very, very key player in a lot of the major NASA missions over the years. P. Diddy's dad was a bodyguard for Frank Lucas, who was this massive drug kingpin in the 1970s. There's just a lot of really strange stories like this. So I think this is actually going to be my next video where I'll just kind of list out some celebrities with these really strange backgrounds who come from families with really bizarre links to some major people and events. Anyway, with this whole Harry Connick Jr. thing, like I said, there's no smoking gun that proves 100% beyond a doubt that he got his big break or got his foot in the door because of what his dad did with Jim Garrison's JFK research files. But the whole coincidence here definitely seemed just a little too strange, and just the whole story itself is a really bizarre story. So I wanted to make a video about it. So I hope you enjoyed it. Big shout out to the members here on YouTube and on Patreon. Thanks so much for your support. I really, truly greatly appreciate it. It means a lot to me. And thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you soon with another video.